The 1950s was out of sight. Civil rights. The 1950s decade saw the first major victories for civil rights. One of the most famous civil rights activists during the 1950s was Martin Luther King Jr. MLK made a huge impact on racial equality and helping to end legal segregation of African Americans. In the 1950s, everyday things were segregated, and that's just the way it was. If someone didn't like or agree with it, that was too bad. There was nothing they could do to change it, or so they thought. In 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. You could even say Rosa Parks sat down to stand up for what she believed in. This incident started the Montgomery bus boycott. This was when African Americans boycotted segregated public buses, and because colored people were the majority of people riding the buses, they lost a great deal of money. This sparked the SCLC, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by MLK. After African Americans returned home from World War II, they were no longer willing to accept injustices at home. Another organization was the NAACP. This was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, leading the United States Civil Rights Organization. Billy Graham was an American Christian evangelist and a Southern Baptist minister. He was also a spiritual advisor to several United States presidents. During the 1950s, there was an outbreak of civil disobedience, which was the refusal to obey certain laws, demands, and commands in a nonviolent resistance. A famous U.S. Supreme Court case in the 1950s was Brown v. Board of Education. The court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for blacks and white students unconstitutional. Because of this, started what is known as Little Rock Nine. This was a group of 9 African American students who were enrolled in Little Rock Central High School. Economics. In the 1950s, the lifestyles were a lot different than they are today. People started to move to a region of the United States called the Sun Belt. This area stretched across the southwest. People started to move there because of the invention of air conditioning. This was not the only reason people started moving. In the 1950s, as African Americans started moving into the city, the white population started moving to the country. These people were referred to as white flights. They moved to rural areas and created communities known as suburbs. The states near the Great Lakes were once known for their steel production. This area was commonly referred to as the Rust Belt. Boom! When the young males returned to the United States after fighting in World War II, the number of newborn children dramatically increased in the United States. Approximately 79 million babies were born. This generation is still referred to today as the baby boom. Now don't let me fool you. The 1950s weren't just a blast. There was some funky things that happened too. For example, an infectious viral disease known as polio spread from person to person that left thousands of people paralyzed. Luckily, in 1952, the first polio vaccine was created. In the 1950s, the cost of items was drastically lower than they are today. If you walked into a convenience store today and wanted to buy a Hershey's chocolate bar, you would pay close to $2. If you walked into a convenience store during the 1950s to buy the same Hershey's chocolate bar, you would only pay 5 cents. And if you took the $2 you would use to buy a Hershey's bar now and used it to buy Hershey's bars in the 50s, you could buy 40 chocolate bars. But before you spend your money on chocolate, take a few seconds to look at the dollar bill. I'm sure we've all seen the expression printed on the bill, "In God We Trust." In 1957, this term started appearing on paper money. This was the result of people becoming more religious. As you can see, the 50s had a lot of organizations. One was the OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They tried to secure a steady income to the member states and to secure supply of the oil to the consumers. Politics! Dwight D. Eisenhower was a president with the goal of conserving people's money but being more dynamic for rights, with dynamic conservation. He also made a speech referred to as the Eisenhower Doctrine, stating a country could request American economic assistance from the U.S. military forces if it was being threatened. A mutual defense treaty between 8 communist states of Central and Eastern Europe in existence during the Cold War was called the Warsaw Pact. An ambitious set of proposals put forward by President Truman was the Fair Deal. Do you know who the 37th President of the United States was? He belonged to the Republican Party, and he was the first president to resign from office. It was Richard Nixon, or Ricardo Nixardo, a political organization and army in Vietnam who fought the United States during the Vietnam War was called Viet Cong. Fidel Castro was a Cuban leader who spent his time giving legal representation to the poor in Havana. The Korean War was a war between North Korea and South Korea. The NSC-68 was a 58-page top-secret policy paper issued by the United States National Security Council. Popular culture. When people think of the 1950s and its popular culture, the first thing that usually comes to mind is rock and roll. Rock and roll is a popular music genre. Its main audience was teenagers. Parents hated this music because it influenced their children to rebel. Teenagers liked rock and roll because it was a way to stick it to the man. One American musician really knew how to stick it to the man, and that was Elvis Presley. He was one of the most popular musicians of the 20th century, usually referred to as the king of rock and roll. Something else very popular in the 1950s was television, one of the best inventions ever. In the 1950s, there wasn't much to watch on TV, but the shows that were on were loved, like Lucy. I love Lucy. It was an American television sitcom, and it was the most watched show in the United States in 4 of its 6 seasons. Another classic show was Howdy Doody, an American children's TV show, shown Sunday mornings. It was the first children's program in color. Another great invention in the 1950s was the microwave. Did you know that microwaves were created by accident? They were used as radar systems. The actual microwaves were able to spot Nazi warplanes on their way to bomb the British. Not longer after both microwaves and TVs came out were TV dinners. Swanson TV dinners actually started after a poor Thanksgiving sale left Swanson food with huge surplus of turkey. So they conceived an idea to package the turkey with other foods in an easy-to-prepare meal container. Before an even easier way to get food fast, you could walk or drive to McDonald's. McDonald's was first along Route 66, and it was created with intentions for teenagers to stop there after school, roll up in their cars, and order something fatty, greasy, and oh so delicious. In the 1950s, more and more toys started to come out. The reason for this was the baby boom. A very popular toy was the hula hoop. The hula hoop is still loved today. Older kids loved this toy because it took skill, and they could do something their younger brothers and sisters couldn't. In the 1950s came out another famous toy called the Mr. Potato Head. Mr. Potato Head was a lot different in the 50s than it is now. In the 50s, the toy actually only included the facial and body parts, and kids were supposed to stick the pieces into real potatoes. Some significant people of the 1950s were Nikita Khrushchev, Elvis Presley, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Richard Nixon, Emmett Till, Fidel Castro, Jackie Robinson, Mickey Mantle, and Yogi Berra. This concludes my 1950s documentary. Have a safe trip home, and thank you for coming to Mel's